Rob Storr does a number of things very well, and this has put him in great demand and made him a prominent player in the world of art. He was a curator in the Department of Painting and Sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art from 1990 to 2002, where he organized exhibitions of the works of Elizabeth Murray, Gerhard Richter, Max Beckmann, Tony Smith, and Robert Ryman. When he left the museum, he was named the first Resley Solo Professor of Modern Art at the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU. Note to my students, he did this with only an MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. He's also taught at the CUNY Graduate Center and the Bard Center for Curatorial Studies, as well as at RISD, Tyler, the Studio School, and Harvard University. In 2007, he was named the first American commissioner of the Venice Biennale, and he is now the dean of the Yale School of Art. While doing all of these things, Rob has always thought of himself as an artist first, a painter. Not knowing his work as an artist, I've always thought of him as a writer first. His writing is crisp, knowledgeable, and supple. He does not just write competently and clearly, he writes beautifully. This is very rare. The other thing that sets him apart, for me, is that he always writes about art as if something extremely important were at stake. This gives his writing an urgency that is missing from too much art writing today. He is playful but never flip or superficial because he knows that the issues are too important. This seriousness in relation to the big questions about art and his refusal to accept reductive and ultimately negative approaches to art have earned him some very high-profile enemies, and I've never seen him shy away from a fight. I don't always agree with him, but I've never doubted his commitment, and I trust his eyes. Tonight he will speak about the remarkable similarities and differences between two of our finest living artists, Gerhard Richter and Robert Ryman. This is going to be a treat. Please welcome Robert Storr.
When Levi first asked me to do this, I said yes, partly because my understanding was that this was primarily for a course of people who were studying art criticism. And I presume that they're scattered in amongst you here. And with your permission, I will speak to them first and to the rest of you as part of the conversation. But I'd like to sort of address some of their concerns in the process. Apropos of what he said about things being important, I often remember a phrase of the surrealist Paul Éluard, who was writing about Picasso, this was in the 40s, who said, "Je parle de ce qui est bien, de ce qui est beau, et de ce qui m'aide à vivre," which is literally, I speak of that which is good, which is beautiful, and that which helps me to live. I think the idea that art could possibly help us to live in difficult circumstances or in sometimes better circumstances is something that gets lost in the shuffle a little bit, and it is a sufficiently idealistic statement that it is almost too much so to be taken very seriously in a skeptical time. But in fact, first of all, don't forget that Éluard was a surrealist and he had a fine sense of irony and of subversive intent. It seems to me that that is nonetheless a pretty good place to start for most things. If things are not good and if they're not beautiful, and by beautiful I don't mean pretty, and if they don't help you to live, you should reasonably ask yourself why get exercised one way or another about them very much. As to my sort of multiple vocations, it's true actually that I am a painter. Almost nobody does know my work, and I've tried not to mix it into my other lives when I was in a more public domain. But it is what has fueled me, and particularly it's what's fueled my interest in the two artists I've chosen tonight to talk about. As a writer, I sort of came into this whole situation backwards. I wrote an angry letter to the editor once, to the Village Voice, and Peter Sheldall was gracious enough to respond with a cordial letter explaining why I was completely wrong, but why I was interested in my anger. For a period of time we were friends, and for a period of time he was very supportive of me, and he got me my first critical job. But my approach to criticism has never been academic. It has never been philosophical, theoretical, although I read a lot of art history and I read theory and philosophy also, and I read poetry, I read a lot of things. But more of what would be called, I think, a generally now disdained genre of belletristic writing, to write personal essays that mix all kinds of things and permit the writer to move as consciousness and sensibility and, sort of one's imagination moves, and to record that, in part because what it really does is to record an experience of art and make that record available to somebody else who will eventually, I think, experience it as well, one hopes will experience as well. And under those circumstances, being right is far less interesting than being engaging, because the point is to get people to the work. To bring them to that work with sufficient information, with sufficient analytical complication, that they won't just simply adore it or hate it or whatever it is that you may have to say about it, but that they will actually do what is right by it by thinking as hard and looking as hard as you have done or hope that they will do. Now, having said that as a sort of preamble, this particular pair of artists have been important to me on a number of levels, and I've worked in relation to their work and to them over a very long period of time. They might seem, in the minds of some people, to be rather an odd couple, given that Richter is very much known for a kind of bold gestural abstraction, and known also for extremely troubling sometimes, in any case, extremely complicated and sometimes also diffident imagistic paintings. Whereas Ryman is an artist who is known primarily for works of poise and reserve and restraint and a kind of classical beauty within the idioms of modern abstract painting. There are, however, some points where they meet. And while we're at it, I'm going to not illustrate this talk with slides, at least in the first half, but merely show you some things, so I'll tell you what I'm showing you now. This is a very early picture of Ryman's. It is this big, so that what you're looking at is this vastly exaggerated version of a very intimate painting. And it was photographed in this version for the show that I did with Bob at the Museum of Modern Art in 1991-92, because you can see the side of the painting at the same time as you see the front. Ideally, one under certain circumstances would see only the side and then the front, or maybe only the front and then the side, but to treat each surface of the painting, and by the way, there's a top and another side and a bottom, to treat each surface of these painting as a painting. A whole object with paint on all surfaces and with elements that are, in a sense, self-sufficient, whether or not you know the rest of the whole surround. And then, as you can see also, this painting, albeit very small, reads very powerfully at a distance. It is a painting conceived in a large visual format or in a visual framework, even though the physical object is small. In that respect, it's a little bit like Tony Smith, who was able to create monumental sculptures out of tiny little units, a tetrahedra that he assembled in such a way that they held space, they dominated space, without being overbearingly large and without being ridiculously diminutive either. In this case, this painting dominates you to a certain extent because it's been blown up. But if I had the power to dial this down, you would find that on this white screen, this painting simply would not go away. And it's this ability to control space with very specific decisions as a painter that is really Bob Ryman's genius. So I will go through a series of paintings, by no means covering the depth and breadth of his work, but things that are emblematic in some way of the approach that he has taken. But back to the question of similarities and dissimilarities. Ryman is, roughly speaking, of an age with Gerhard Richter. Ryman was born in 1930, as was incidentally Jasper Johns, and someday I would like to explore the relation between the two. Here are two artists who are essentially autodidacts, who have spent much of their life making paintings in which surface and the objectivity of the canvas are a major factor. They have both used their signatures as dominant elements of the image rather than as some sort of incidental identification marks. They've used numbers in the same way, and yet neither one has influenced the other. Both of them have recognized a certain set of possibilities and acted on them independently, as a result of which you have a very, very active dialogue, although one that doesn't really sort of take place much in discussions about them. And they both began their careers in the early 1960s. Ryman's earliest paintings date from 1955, which is again the year in which Johns' first paintings came to the surface. But it's the early 60s in which he began to really be seen in any way and begin to figure into the dialogue about art. Another point of common ground is the ways in which both artists were appropriated by critical discourses that were in certain fundamental ways hostile to the artist's own understanding of their medium and of its aims. Specifically, it had to do with a moment in art critical writing in which it was deemed that painting would have to die, should die, in which the very practice to which they were devoted would somehow disappear either before they stopped doing it themselves, of course neither one has stopped, or while they stopped doing it, or maybe after their demise. But in any case, the very strong arguments that painting for some strange meta-historical reason was coming to an end, and therefore what they represented to critics of this ilk were the last saving remnants of legitimate painting before, disaster, before total decadence. And this is a leitmotif of an awful lot of so-called postmodernist criticism of the 80s and 90s. It's worth remembering, of course, that the end of painting has haunted painting throughout the 20th century. It really begins in the teens of the 20th century in various and sundry corners of the artistic world. In Russian constructivism on the one hand, in surrealism on the other. The French poet Louis Aragon, who also doubled as an art critic, who also tripled as a Stalinist apparatchik, wrote a very famous essay called Défi à la peinture in the 20s, and Anne Umland has worked on this for exhibition purposes at MoMA for a very long time, in which he explained how it was that painting would come to an end via collage and all of those affiliated things, and his principal example was Miro. Now, the fact that Miro struggled with painting, the fact that Miro made many things that could be deemed anti-painting is indisputable. The fact that Miro continued to paint is also indisputable. And the fact that Louis Aragon, after having written this polemic, went on to become a great admirer of the painter that anti-painters love to hate, Henri Matisse, and devoted 2 very thick volumes to something he called Henri Matisse a roman, or Henri Matisse a novel, tells you a good deal about the staying power of absolutist, teleological, apocalyptic ideas. So such ideas are very invigorating. Modernism has benefited greatly from the fact that they throw a shock into the system. Modern criticism and modern art history has suffered enormously from people who treat these things not as polemic, which is their function, but as if they were somehow revealed truths. And therefore all the rest of the information you have, all the rest that you know, that you've seen, must be aligned with the necessity that this prediction come true, even and especially when it is not coming true. So when you look at the situation of painting in the 1980s, the principal impetus behind this end of painting argument was that the critics involved simply didn't like the painting that was in fact flourishing all around them, which misnamed and representing many tendencies that had nothing to do with each other at all, was called neo-expressionism. Thus Douglas Crimp in 1981 wrote an article called The End of Painting, which was widely read, and which particularly cites Richter and his so-called his belief that painting was pure idiocy as proof that painting somehow had to come to an end, and that Richter had the benefit of being somebody who did it, but who understood that it was all nonsense. This, unfortunately, was not what Richter understood by what Richter had said in that statement. Yves Lambois wrote an article in 1986 called Painting the Task of Mourning, in which he picked up this theme, but with a sort of more elegiac tone, rather than murdering painting in its bed, presumably an old age home bed. This is like, there'll be death panels for painting. But rather that it would somehow come to a beautiful dying fall, in which case Ryman became a central exhibit of the argument, that Ryman would make the most wonderful last paintings as the lights went out in painting, something like that. Again, as I said, neither of these things was true or came true. Neither one of these things had much to do with what the artists themselves were actually doing or thinking, and actually what they were saying, since both Richter and Ryman have been quite forthright about their attitudes and what they think their situation has been. Now, as I said, in this kind of writing, the standard members of this saving covenant of painting are Frank Stella, although not after his early paintings, Ryman, Ellsworth Kelly, sometimes Bryce Marden, and Gerhard Richter. Now, I happen to share a taste for all of those artists, and more than a taste. It's not just that I like them, that I think they're engaging, serious, challenging, and interesting. And in the Biennale that I did in Venice in 2007, I rounded up some of them, not all of them, which were Richter, Ryman, Zigmar Polke, and Ellsworth Kelly, in an exhibition which also included some less celebrated artists, Sherry Sambal, Raoul de Keyser, and Thomas Neskowski. All of them representing, for me, in my view, the kinds of painting that could be done and the kinds of diversity that painting actually represented in the present tense, not as a historical, backward-looking exercise, but now, to treat these artists as our contemporaries. It is doing that, which I think is very important. By the way, half of this picture is a monochrome, even white, and the other half you can see is more variegated surface. The problem with Ryman's art is that it is the absolute example of how the age of reproduction is defeated by painting, and how painting is necessary in order to remind people how to look and how to experience a combination of factors, color, texture, scale, etc. And you can make pictures of paintings, and yet you can never reproduce painting. And in fact, in some cases, you can't even make pictures, and this is close to an example of it as we're going to have in this selection, but there are others. And some years ago, when working on a catalog for Ryman for a show in France, we basically drove the color correction guy into a mental asylum because he desperately tried to balance warm and cool tones, textures and edges, and so on and so forth. And I felt terrible for him, but I must say I also admired his courage that he really tried to do this. But what it really tells us is that the only way to know what Ryman is about is to see real Rymans, period. Anyway, back to the question of treating these artists as contemporaries. If an artist began their career in the early 1960s, for many of you in this room, that is beyond ancient history. On the other hand, there is no reason to think that if they are living and active during your lifetime, that they belong to some past era, that they are circumscribed by the decade of their emergence or by some stylistic attribute that is associated with a group or tendency or whatever. Painters, good painters, as I say, paint in the present tense, and they're therefore painting in your tense, in your world. And you need to treat them seriously as a result. You need to understand that they are your competition if you're an artist, or if you're a critic, you need to understand that they are competitive with everything else that's going along. They're not simply sitting back on their laurels and waiting for, accolades, but not actually engagement with the present situation. And a couple of strong examples of this were the ways in which Willem de Kooning, who has an enormous show now at the MoMA, was sort of re-entered the dialogues around painting in the 80s, when he was actually at the very end of his life, in certain ways incapacitated, in other ways actually freer than he had ever been. And although long discussed as belonging to the abstract expressionist generation, which was being actively deconstructed and critiqued, and I have nothing against that, fair enough, deconstruct and critique all you like, but if somebody makes a good, vivid, living painting, the deconstruction, the critique doesn't get you off the hook of understanding what's in it, how it got to be that way, and of responding to it as something in the present situation. And I dare say that de Kooning was very much responsive to what was going on around him, as well as to his own past histories, and that is why one looks at him. The same held true the decade before with Philip Guston, who, as much as any American painter, kicked off Neo-Expressionism. And if many of the Neo-Expressionists misunderstood what he was about, lacked ambitions sort of the same degree as his, nonetheless, a great many of them did learn an enormous amount that was useful to them, and certainly he liberated them from the kind of dogmas, particularly those that said they should not paint, since Guston had been through time and again tendencies and moments and movements and critical discourses which said what he was doing was irrelevant. Now, as I said, these artists represent two distinctly different views of what art is for and how it works and how it operates. I, for one, am grateful for those differences. I think it's important, if one is really going to be seriously engaged with art, that you actually engage with things that are contradictory, incommensurable, and that force you, in fact, to unearth and examine and grow around those parts of one's sensibility or one's, judgment, reasoned judgment about art, although reason is not a very good thing to apply to art too much. The need to reconcile the irreconcilable, or the decision to not reconcile the irreconcilable, but to let things that go in different directions coexist, is the first part of actually coming to terms with art as it is and oneself as a complex being. For all the discussion we've had in postmodern era about the plurality of identity and about the ways in which none of us actually are easily unified, in fact, never will be easily unified, it's remarkable how quickly people respond to the pinprick of, well, don't you believe X? And if you believe X, how could you be interested in Y, right? The answer, of course, is that one can do both. And one actually can do several more things at once, probably not all in the same minute, but the ability to understand the multiple facets of a medium or of a body of work, an era of work, an individual artist's production, and of one's own identity within relation to it, is a sign of actually maturity in relation to art, rather than the opposite. Beyond that, I would say, as a lapsed Marxist, that thinking dialectically helps too. And it's remarkable the number of people who speak in Marxist language but who don't have a clue about dialectics, who actually think in an entirely linear and normative and predictive ways. Dialectics involves dealing with contradiction, its resolution, and its reassertion. That's what it is. And it also involves creation of new frameworks and terms and so on as a result of such tensions. And the people who insist counter to the evidence, who insist counter to this very principle of dialectics, that art history must do this or must do that, are not dialecticians at all, any more than any apparatchik of any ideology is a dialectician. They are simply, giving you the revealed truth according to somebody. Just to give you an idea of what painting can be in Ryman's world, here, for example, are two surface veils. These are paintings that were made on fiberglass. You can see now the darkened area, the sort of brownish area, is fiberglass. And it has absorbed what was in fact an awful lot of nicotine smoke in the air when Bob painted these, so that it nicely stands out. It was once a softer beige color. And it's superimposed on wax paper, which is attached directly to the wall with masking tape. And what you see there is paint itself, white paint, held sort of in the zone of the visible at the surface of this sort of shield of fiberglass, presented further by the two framing devices. Now, what Ryman has done more than any artist of his generation is to explore the ways in which painting can be applied and the number of surfaces to which it can be applied in ways that makes it look utterly different than it looked the last time you saw it. He is somebody who has worked throughout his life, in a sense, to demonstrate that the so-called terminus of painting, which many people once thought was Malevich's composition, White on White, of 1918-20, is not in fact the terminus. It is in fact the beginning of a whole new set of possibilities. And this is an argument I've used before, and if you've read it before, I apologize for repeating myself, but anyway. As you will know, in mathematics, there are two infinities. There are the infinities of addition and the infinities of division. And if some artists add, if you will, to the length of the line of painting, or maybe it's a spiral, actually I think it is, there are other artists who subdivide points on it and realize for the viewer that an infinity of possibilities exists within any one of these points. And if in a way we take it as a sort of construct that what Richter has done is to add on units, points. What Ryman has done is to show that an equal degree of infinity, of equal resonance, can be found by simply taking what we think we can name as one thing and finding out that the actual manifestations of that name are multiple, like the numbers of colors of white that an Eskimo would see at the Arctic. I'm going to start, though, with some of the differences. And I'm going to try and talk a little bit about the ways in which the two artists have thought about each other. The first thing is that whenever I have mentioned Ryman, or I should say, when I've mentioned Richter to Ryman, not whenever, the first time I mentioned Richter to Ryman, he expressed a kind of impatience, I have to say, and puzzlement. Because he said, and I can't remember his exact words, but it was something to the effect, well, I can't understand how he can make all those different things. I don't understand where his commitment lies. He, I think, felt about him, as did many, many, many people until quite recently, that Richter was in some ways a kind of clever chameleon, a chameleon of talent, but somebody who didn't have a sort of driving impulse behind his work, but was able nonetheless to touch all kinds of bases and to do it dazzlingly. And commitment is something very important to Ryman, so this was a serious challenge to what Richter did. Richter, I think, has sometimes felt of me that I lacked commitment because I was interested in so many different things that he couldn't countenance. And I can remember his response, for example, to the Elizabeth Murray show, which he saw when he came back to the Modern once. And he was polite enough not to say what he thought, but he thought I was completely daft to have done it. I think also maybe Elizabeth felt a little bit the same way about Gerhard. Now, it's understandable that artists feel these kinds of things because they're deeply invested in their way of doing things. But it's also the case for critics and for curators that you don't have to line up all of these things in order to have positions. One can have real positions in the world in engagement, argument, admiration with many kinds of work. There are so many other kinds of work that neither engage or irritate you sufficiently or give you reasons to admire them that you don't even deal with them at all. So when people ask me, well, what are you really interested in, Rob? I say I'm really interested in things in the things that I have shown real interest in. I don't waste much time writing bad reviews, although occasionally I think they're necessary just to even up the score in a particular situation or to clarify some arguments that haven't been made. But it's not my business to rate on other people's parades. But if you'd like to compose a list of people I haven't written about, you can presume that a good many of them are people I don't think so highly of. So when I therefore take positions that create polarities within them by making exhibitions or writing articles, they are a kind of way of mapping territory that seems to me worth mapping and hinting at connections that seem to me worth exploring. And I sort of will consider that sufficient for me, and if it's not sufficient for others, so be it. Now, on the Richter's side, I didn't know what he thought of Ryman's paintings until I was in his studio one day working on the show that I did at the Modern, and I mentioned in passing that Ryman had a big retrospective show at the museum in Bonn, at which he said, let's go. And we were almost immediately thereafter in his BMW driving 95 miles an hour down the Autobahn to get to this exhibition. And when we got to it, he was as slow in the galleries as he had been fast on the road. And so I just sort of spun off and looked at things my way, and he looked at things his way, but he crawled the walls. He looked very, very intently at how things were made, at how they read at a distance, and so on and so forth. And he has always spoken, before even this, with real admiration of Ryman's work. And it'll factor into what I'm going to say later, because this is a case of somebody who can recognize the sort of unshakable merit and seriousness of something he cannot do. And the reasons he cannot do them are the things that are, in a sense, the substance of his art. Now, as I said, I want to sort of preface when I get to the questions of their different orientations and their common orientations. I want to underscore the fact that neither one of them has ever seen themselves as an exponent or an example of the end of painting. Quite the contrary, both of them have explicitly stated that they view the future of painting as having a future. In the case of Richter, it's a future with many question marks, with many possible ruptures, breaks, tensions, and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, he has never thought of himself as a person who was the sort of the sapper inside the citadel of painting, strategically blowing up its foundations, as in fact has been the argument made by a number of critics on his behalf, despite his statements to this contrary. In terms of Ryman, I remember him saying at one point that what struck him was not that abstraction had run its course, but how new abstraction was. In fact, if you think of it, abstraction more or less begins around 1907 or so. with Kandinsky and other artists. 1970, of course, is the date of Demoiselle d'Avignon. So it's a case of how very quickly one moves from a fractured, broken abstraction of representation, increasingly through Kandinsky and others, into pictures that are, to use another piece of jargon, non-objective. Pictures that are not pictures. Pictures that are themselves organizations of space, color, touch, et cetera, with no other referent than what you see within the context of the painting. And Ryman said, and I think rightly, that if that's the case, abstraction at the time he said it wasn't even 100 years old. And 100 years old is, in the history of art, is a blink of the eye. Now, the logic of the end of painting treats painting as if it were kind of a case study of something in the epistemic atmosphere of philosophy and theory and so on and so forth. And once you've resolved the questions of that particular epistemic idea, you don't need the art anymore. Nobody needs to make it anymore. Work's done. Go home. The problem is that painters don't paint for those reasons. I don't know any of them that do. And if they keep producing examples of things that neither bear out those presumptions, but on the contrary actually open up the prospects for painting, then one has to re-examine whether that kind of thinking has any merit whatsoever. And as I said, for Ryman, abstract art was young, and he has proven by example that white on white, here's another one, this is another done on fiberglass, on wax paper, and with masking tape. And just to take a sidebar on the specific works, what you're seeing is a work in which absolutely everything that you see counts as the work, inasmuch as looking at the side of a Ryman painting with the touch of color on the side and on the top and so on and so forth means that a canvas becomes a complete gestalt, a complete object. The same thing happens when you take paint off of canvas and put it on these other surfaces. And it is the color of the masking tape and the length of the line, of the tab of the line, and so on and so forth that makes this what it is. And you see the whole thing at once and you think relationally about it. So that, for example, the phantom grid, if you will, is the masking tape. It's also the weave, although it's not vertical and horizontal, it's kind of a filament, of the fiberglass. It's also the orientation of one rectangle within another rectangle and then this sort of trapezoidal area of paint. But all of these things are extensions of the discourse of the grid in painting, but in forms completely novel until he made them. I would add one other thing curatorially. A painting not exactly like this, but somewhat like this and very big, was installed at the Ryman show at the Modern. And the art handlers, all of whom were artists and who were extremely, had very good eyes and good minds and so on and so forth, started to install it, and being scrupulous and also having a registrar hovering over their shoulder, and some other staff people, began to take this 8x10 glossy, because that's what we had up until very recently, took an 8x10 glossy from Ryman's gallery and tried to calculate the exact distance between each one of the pieces of masking tape and the exact length of each one of the pieces of masking tape. And sure enough, the thing looked awful, because not only had they not probably gotten it exactly right, but it looked stilted until Bob came into the gallery and said, "Oh, that's not right, come on, you just do it like this." And then you just peel the tape off and like this. And, and that was made it work. Another thing happened once with a Bob Morris piece, which is made out of all kinds of bedding and wire and so on and so forth. And it too looked dead until one of the art handlers came along and said, "Listen, you got to fluff it like a bed." Suddenly it was alive again. So the question of how you display works like this, which are built of contingencies, which talk to primary structures in art but are built of contingencies, is a major, major issue. It's where curatorial practice overlaps really with critical practice. Anyway, let me see. Now, the thing they have in common is something like this. Both of these artists are concerned with what painting makes visible and view making things visible as a primary function of art. Now, it seems like an incredibly small statement, but to make something visible, truly visible, and to make it memorably visible is not easy at all. And if you think of the avalanche of images we consume every day, in all forms, in all places, and how many of them we forget, and how many of them really don't hold us to begin with, the question of making something visible becomes a huge challenge. Even within the confines of the white cube where you eliminate all of that visual static, it becomes a matter of, okay, why would one look so long at something made of wax tape wax paper and masking tape and fiberglass filament and some white paint? This, by the way, is painted on cardboard in a wonderful kind of a semi-gloss, and I think it's enamelac, but anyway, it's a commercial paint in great sweeps. And this is one unit out of a long line of units that are the same in format, but each one unique in terms of the execution of it, so that you see the differences in stroke and so on. Now, one can align something like this in the discourse of gesture, for example. And kill it deader than a doornail. You can talk about the gesture in New York painting, and this is gesture and so on and so forth. It's all true in a way. And Ryman is an artist who comes out of the generation where the abstract expressionists were the predecessors, the antecedents. And in terms of the first painting I showed you, Bob worked in the Museum of Modern Art for, I think, 9 years altogether. And one of his most important experiences was watching the installation of the first major Rothko retrospective that was to take place in this country, that took place at the Modern, and Rothko coming into the galleries and working on the installation of the painting. But Bob was the guard standing there all day long, and he began to understand deeply the fact that the painting around the edges of Rothko's paintings was not an incidental thing. The elimination of frames and the fact that the side of the paintings was painted in most mature Rothkos, and that surface was itself painting, was a discovery made on the job as a guard by an artist who had essentially not gone to art school. And it was like how you have somebody who has a clear eye see something with a vividness that people who are following the literature of painting may miss, because you can look at the front of the Rothko and think about the sublime and the gesture and blah, 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 and all that's true again, I'm not knocking it. But you can also completely miss this other dimension which qualifies everything that you then see in the front. Here's some other gestures. And here is one example of many in which the notion that Ryman paints only white paintings is pretty vividly denied. So what can be made visible is the question, or how is something made visible is the question that Ryman poses. Those terms of visibility are his terms. Another version of them, Richter's terms, are what can and cannot be painted. And in that case, he's talking about subject matter. And it might as well jump in here and say that for Richter, there is no such thing as abstraction. All paintings are pictures inherently. And when you read Richter catalogs, it says in German, abstraktes Bild, which means abstract picture, which is a contradiction in terms for those of you who believe that abstraction is in fact the denial of the pictorial except as a structure, the representational in any case. But for him, all painting is inherently elusive to reference outside of itself, if they are not actually brought in by the artist and stated and depicted and described. So here we have two very different points of view. But the idea of certain things being made visible and of other things being impossible to paint sort of point to tensions or relations between the two that seem to me, at their most minimal form, nonetheless, describe a primary preoccupation that both have. Now, as to Ryman, if you take the view that Ryman is engaged in the last gasp of painting, you go off on a tangent. It's better, actually, to ask him what he is thinking about, and I did. So in an interview I did with him in the mid-1980s, I said something to say in response to a previous statement he made about what does painting communicate? And he said, and again, these are words which, like Edouard's words, seem unbelievably idealistic or maybe even corny, but here they are. What does painting communicate? An experience of, and then there was a considerable pause, enlightenment. An experience of delight and well-being and rightness. It's like listening to music, like going to an opera and coming out of it and feeling somehow fulfilled. That what you experienced was necessary. It sustained you for a while. You can't explain it to someone who did not experience it, and this is crucial, it seems to me. You cannot say that they played this and they did that. You can say that they played this and they did that, but it won't make any sense at all. That's not what it's about. It's about the experience of delight and fulfillment. That is achieved. That is also done by painting. I think probably that's the only thing painting is about. Whether it's abstract or representational, that's what it is. That's what it does. The primary experience is the experience of enlightenment. And I will say parenthetically that Ryman owns representational paintings and maintains active relationships with people who make representational paintings, not least Meryl Wagner, his wife, who does both abstract and representational paintings. So the notion that Ryman somehow occupies a position in the land of the pure vis-a-vis these issues of representation and abstraction is an error. That his own paintings do not represent anything other than themselves is more to the point. Now, he mentions music in this relation, and it's important to know that Ryman came to New York to study jazz, and his job at the Museum of Modern Art was the day job to pay for his jazz lessons. So that his orientation to music is, again, direct and immediate. It's not a variation of Walter Pater's famously sort of metaphysical statement that all art constantly aspires towards the condition of music. It was certainly not, again, really in the vein of Rothko or of Still or others who wanted to be explicitly transcendentalist in what they did, although there is a deep respect for their work, separate from whether the rhetoric of that work is something that he would himself indulge in. Rather, Ryman is a realist by his own definition and a materialist. The realism of his paintings is the reality of the thing itself, of the components of it and their organization and their presence in space and the presence of the viewer in relation to them. There is nothing more real than this work. And it's a challenge to realism of a representational nature to say this, and it was a deliberate challenge to it, not to, in fact, pull the rug out from under representational painting, but to revalue the word real in a fashion that would make people look hard and think hard in relation to what they take for granted when they call it self-realism. There's also a degree of materialism, since we're talking about material reality, and a willingness to be ultra-materialist in the same way that, for example, the Shakers are ultra-materialist. Their things may be beautiful, they may be proportionate, they may give a kind of a lift to the spirit, but they begin in the thing itself and in the way it's made. And in that sense, I think that is more or less how one can understand the larger ambition in relation to the specific terms of aesthetics, which is it possible to have a realist, materialist enlightenment, a realist, materialist delight? Is it possible to have something that is like music in the same sense that music of our era is made of notes by instruments in time, and that is not valued by us because it suggests to us some kind of transcendental, otherworldly consciousness, but because precisely it is so much in the present and we are so absorbed and held in the present by it. In Ryman's own terms, he simply said, "There is never a question of what to paint, but only how to paint. The how of painting has always been the image." And here are some more examples. I'll just go through them very quickly. This is a large painting. This is a small painting. Here you can see the width of the brush against the canvas. You can see the drag of the canvas. You can see the pastiness of the paint. Everything is ultra-specific, and everything at the same time is open because none of these strokes are made according to a programmed length. It is the nature of how much material goes to the canvas, what the pressure does, and so on and so forth. So this is, again, kind of an improvisational work with limited means. This is the same challenge writ large or painted large, again small, but you can see, in a sense, the intervals of Rothko's paintings without any attempt to specifically reference Rothko. And here you can see how incredibly rich and impasted and pasty it is. This is not austere painting. You can't put that much oil paint on a surface like that and make it so incredibly tangible and treat it as if somehow it was an exercise in the denial of the senses. This is hedonist painting with white paint. This is a recent painting, relatively speaking, and you can see here these two gray bars are versions of gray bars that go all the way back to the beginning of the cycle I showed you, where you have a vast expanse and a gray bar on the side. The fact that Ryman, like many artists of his kind, doubles back on himself, and that's why I think the history of painters and of art in general is a spiral rather than linear. straight line, is that one goes back and picks up a thread, picks up an option, thinks differently about something one has done, or in some cases thinks differently about something that somebody else has done, and reinvigorates it by finding a way to make it fresh. And this, relatively late Ryman, this is one of the paintings that was actually in the Venice Biennale. Now, to conclude with Ryman, for the moment anyway, is simply to say that Ryman has, for all intents and purposes, a relatively optimistic approach to painting. He believes in its continued possibility because it in fact has proven itself open to new possibilities. His paintings are a record of what those possibilities have been for him, but they're an indicator of what possibilities might exist for others. Some artists essentially take over a certain territory and entirely dominate to the point that there's no way one can enter into it without being their clone. Ryman is one of those artists, and I'm not saying this is better or worse, I'm just saying they're different, is one of those artists who opens territories which you can cross and intersect with in some fashion and take away things that are useful, and if you're smart, your work will never look like Ryman's at all, but it can have particular ideas, particular ways of approaching problems that would not exist but for his example. And I would only say then beyond this that how different art history is when written by those who actually make it, as distinct from those who seek to divine the will of history in capital letters will and in capital letters history. And the dilemma that Ryman has faced for many years, and as also with Richter, is that they have been written about by people who focus entirely on history's will, on teleological thinking, whose arguments are intricate, compelling, and fundamentally flawed. But they nonetheless continue to do the opposite of what those arguments would indicate. That said, the weight of history lies heavy on Richter's art in a way that it does not on Ryman's. And in all of its manifold dimensions, it lies heavy on Richter's art. Here we have to look less at what is possible than at what is still possible, or what might be possible, or what one might test as a possibility and discover is in fact not an open path. And from here I'm going to shift from any prepared remarks and simply talk about particular works, but try and sketch this out in relation to the, if you will, the polarities of Richter's art. And I'll start with this one. I don't have the beautiful slide that I could have, but I don't think it's necessary. But if you think about this painting as an all-over painting that might have been painted by Ryman. Ryman actually has never scribbled like this. He tends to, they're more sort of like curlicues than broad brush scribbles. But a surface entirely animated by a brush moving through viscous paint. And the single thing that one immediately sees is that this is not white. It's gray. It's a lead gray. It is not luminous, it's light absorbing. It's heavy, indeed, as I said, heaviness is part of Richter's aesthetic from the very get-go. And in a way, this is, and these were made in the early mid-1970s, it is a way Richter's acknowledgement of what it would be like to be free if one could be free. What it would be like to be luminous if one could be luminous. What it would be like to be able to move in a world entirely the present, when one in fact moves in a world which is so heavily weighted with the past. Now the photograph that I don't have, but that is reproduced in a couple of places recently, is a photograph of John Cage standing in front of this painting and smiling. John Cage seemed, except for things like Perilous Night, which he wrote in the 1940s, to have been almost impervious to the tragic. Now I'm not saying he really was, but I'm saying his art is not about the tragic. His art is about antitheses, if you will, to that. But that Richter is somebody who is deeply interested in Cage, encountered him at a distance in the 1960s when he came to the Academy in Dusseldorf as a part of the Fluxus Festum Festorum, I guess it is. I can't remember exactly the way it said. But anyway, Cage was a principal influence on Beuys, as everyone knows, and on all of art in the Rhineland at this time. And the idea of the aleatory, the idea of the sort of complicated use of materials against not against their nature, but against the nature of established ordering systems and so on and so forth, is fundamental to this painting. And with it is, of course, the glimmer of Richter's interest in the relatively optimistic, positive, materialistic, and somewhat transcendental positions that Cage occupied. Now, Cage did not influence Ryman so far as I know. But if you can say that in this early phase of his career, that the dialogue back and forth between Richter and Cage is also in part a dialogue between the options that Cage represented, and some of those options are represented also both in his mind and in the period by what Ryman did. Some more, all over monochrome painting in gray. Here you can actually see underneath the remnants of a painting which looks to be the painting of a piece of architecture. And one thing that you should know about Richter's paintings is that almost all of the abstractions, I wouldn't say almost all, but many of the abstractions actually cover pictures of something. Now, sometimes he begins an abstraction by throwing down totally abstract elements and working against them, but very often the cancellation of a more or less representational painting is the beginning of an abstraction. And I've said to him in the past that what I would like to do sometimes is to do a forensic X-ray study of his entire collected works and do an exhibition of all the hidden Richters underneath all the ones that we know in certain abstract forms. I know what lies under some of them, and while as I respect his right to cancel them out, I wish he hadn't. Here is a painting which is very close, if you will, to a Ryman kind of painting, but again, done in a heavy leaden gray. Beautiful painting. Here's another which is done with kind of a stipple service with basically a rough house painting roller or something of the kind. Here's a famous painting of Betty, and actually the thing behind her should be about the color of the one you just saw. And in fact, probably is the one you just saw, or one very like it. And this sort of positions us a little bit as to what the heaviness of history might actually be. This is Richter's daughter, his eldest daughter. And this was a painting made around the time that he was painting the famous October cycle of the Baader-Meinhof group. And it is her looking into such a painting, and also sort of metaphorically, her looking over her shoulder at this looming, ominous kind of cloud, which might, for that matter, be also history. It's the past as a kind of opaque, oppressive presence. This is, for Richter himself, what that opaque, oppressive presence was. This is, I'm going to go through these very fast. This is Uncle Rudy. This is Gerhard Richter's uncle. This was the man who was held up by his mother as the role model for what he should become in the 1930s, because if you were born in 1930, that means by 1939, you were 7 years old. 39 is the beginning of the war. By the end of the war, you're in your teens. And so Richter basically experienced not only the entire Nazi era, because Hitler came to power in 1933, but thereafter almost the first quarter of the history of Eastern German communism. So this is the man Richter was supposed to be, his uncle, who, as it happened, was killed almost immediately after this picture was taken, the picture from which this painting was made. And you should know also that this particular image was made for an exhibition in Lidice, which is a town in Poland which was destroyed utterly by Heinrich Heydrich, who was the head of the Gestapo and of the SS in Poland. And this was given by Richter to the museum in Lidice in commemoration of what common German soldiers did. Let's not even talk about what the SS did in extermination camps. Let's just talk about what common German soldiers did. So this is Richter's painting of his own family history with all of these immediately impinging sort of awarenesses behind it. This is his father, the person he was not supposed to grow up to be in the estimate of his mother, a kind of Professor Unrat-like fool who failed as a soldier, failed as a school teacher, failed as a husband, failed in every dimension. This is his Aunt Marianne, and that's Richter in the foreground with her. His Aunt Marianne was the brother of Rudy. His Aunt Marianne was schizophrenic and probably some other things as well, and she was hospitalized and then she was exterminated by this man. This is Heinrich Heydrich, a Nazi doctor, one of the pioneers of the final solution, who invented the idea of gassing people in a project called T4. And this is a newspaper photograph of his arrest. He was found in 1959 living more or less openly as a workers' compensation doctor in the New Germany. And of course, the New Germany was in many ways the old Germany. Now, these 4 pictures, and for what it's worth also, the father-in-law of Richter's first wife was also part of the T4 program. So within this particular set of circumstances, subject positions, if you want to use the current jargon, Richter was connected to both the persecutor and the persecuted. He was connected ambivalently towards just about everything that happened in the Nazi Empire at that time as a young boy. This is another thing that happened. These are Mustangs, these are fighter planes, Allied fighter planes, and these are Allied bombers. And Richter was born in Dresden, lived outside of Dresden during the war, and came back to Dresden, which was utterly bombed to smithereens in the famous firebombing of 1944. Or maybe it was 45, I'm sorry. And so his awareness of the war is a combination of the small aspects of it and then also some of these large aspects. And these, of course, are modern fighter planes. Now, in the early 1960s, 65 basically, 64, 65, a German artist chose to paint family album photographs of people representing, as I said, all the subject positions the Germans could possibly have within the Nazi period, or at least, if not all, then many of them, and certainly very conflicting ones, since in one case, as I said, a member of the family is killed by the Nazis, in another case, the members of the family are ardent Nazis, and in another case, yet they are failed Nazis, but might have wanted to succeed. In the same way, there are pictures of the attacks upon Germany by Allied bombings, and then the rearmament of Germany, and not of Germany, the rearmament of Europe after the war, and the development of military bases on German soil, and the arrival of the Cold War and of all of the threats that went with it. Again, most of you in this room are too young to remember most of this. I remember vividly the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I grew up in a world where there were many people who knew what this represented as well. The anti-nuclear movement was born out of a fear that the Third World War would follow closely on the heels of the Second. This is a painting called Madrid, and it's a very simple, although very large, bigger than the screen, picture of Madrid as seen from the air. This is one of Milan, in which you see the Milan Cathedral and also the Galleria, which is a great temple to 19th century commerce against it. And you can't see it very well in this reproduction, but you can see the effect of it. The whole thing sort of does this. And it's painted in such a way that if this is rather solid and massive and bold strokes, this is very fine strokes that are not quite aligned. It's a little bit like watching a TV screen that is out of alignment. So everything seems to shake. But on the other hand, if you come to this image from where Richter came, in other words, from the experience of cities bombed and destroyed, this is, sort of the monuments of secure bourgeois and medieval culture quivering. And this is called Stadtbild. This is an aerial view of a city where the broad, brushy stroke begins to essentially decompose the city. So without explicitly painting a bombardier's view of a city before or during or after a bombardment, it suggests it, and this one even more so. This is Paris. And as you may know, there was a Nazi plan to destroy Paris utterly at the time that they were being driven out of Paris. So the capitals of Europe in the world that Richter grew up in were, many of them, efficiently destroyed by bombardment, sometimes by the Nazis, sometimes by the Allies, and all of the remaining ones were under threat of bombardment and destruction as a result of the Cold War. This, by the way, is called Administrative Building. This is a building of the New Germany, and this is another aerial view of the New Germany. But if you look at a picture like this, or at a picture like this, one should consider what the old Germany was, that these were built on the ruins of the old Germany, whatever it may have been. It could have been old buildings, really old buildings, or it could have been Nazi buildings or whatever. But everything new is a reminder of what was there before. Now, these are color paintings, and these are Richter's first abstractions. I'm going to move pretty quick. But this is pop art, color chart pop art by Richter early on. This is the same thing done systematically and multiplied. This is Richter in dialogue, among others, with Cage and aleatory composition, but also sidebar with Ellsworth Kelly, who was very much influenced by Cage, and whose way of dealing with all of these factors belonged, if you will, to the optimistic, positive, enlightenment, delight side of the equation. This is Richter dealing with gesture. And it's a wonderfully subversive painting, because what you have is a spontaneous gesture, like that, and behind it you have a graded grayscale that is feather brushed with as much refinement as any academic painter ever painted the wall behind a Greek hero. So you have deliberate, artificial, illusionistic effects supporting so-called spontaneity and directness. This is Richter's commentary on Frank Stella. It's a kind of hallucinogenic, or whatever it is, version of one of Stella's nested bar and structure paintings. And we're back to the grayscale paintings. These are the paintings that Richter made for much of his career. And for much of his career, you can see he is working with variables that come straight out of Ryman or out of the generation of artists to which Ryman belonged, but with an attitude, with a skepticism, with an unease, with a self-denial, if you will, that gives these an utterly different meaning. And this is not an exercise in the commentary on art, but actually a statement about the position from which he comes and what is, as he would say, what one can paint and what one can't paint. It's notable that at one point after his first participation in the Venice Biennale in 1972, he had the German Pavilion, he became so enamored of Titian that he painted a copy of Titian's Annunciation 5 times. He painted it because he wanted to own it. And it's the oldest of habits that good technical painters can make their own versions of paintings that they would like to own. I made long ago a version of a Mondrian, which I would like to own, and I'm very glad to own it, because otherwise I wouldn't own anything. But in any case, he painted a Titian, he painted an Annunciation. He was this artist who everybody thought of as was the anti-painting artist, the anti-classical artist, the skeptical, non-believing artist. He paints a religious subject with extreme delicacy, and he doesn't succeed. And each of the successive paintings degrade that image further. So it's kind of narrative, not of sort of Dadaistic pleasure in destruction, but of regretful realization that much as one could technically realize something, it is no longer possible to paint with conviction certain things. They fall outside of one's ability to put all the elements of painting together. And in that sense, Richter could have painted a plausible-looking Ryman. But he couldn't bring himself to paint a plausible working Ryman because he was not motivated by the things that motivated Ryman. So in as much as he can't paint Titian, he can't paint Ryman. So what instead he paints is the impasse that he finds himself, as beautifully as he can paint it, but as much as an impasse as he can possibly paint it. Here's a close-up of one of these sort of pebbled, looks like the side of a bungalow in Los Angeles, but kind of a, deathly bungalow. This is the blow-up of a brush mark, so this is a relatively large painting in which he, again, uses illusionistic techniques to paint just paint. So this is, again, a contradiction in terms. This is the reduction to essentialism in painting by means of 19th century techniques. This is the Baroque variation of those color charts I showed you. You take the primary colors, red, yellow, and blue, and this is what this is called, red, yellow, and blue, and you drag them into each other and they muddy each other up. And so this is almost like a kind of Rubensian extravaganza that ends a process which begins more or less as an Joseph Alberzian exercise. And then these are 3 paintings, and I'll just do them quickly. These are enormous paintings, and they're called January, December, and November in reverse order, painted in 1989. This is his quote-unquote celebration of the fall of East Germany, the fall of the wall, and the reunification of Germany. Counting backwards from that moment, he is feeling the foreboding of what comes next. My aunt is German, half Jewish, and I called her up from Philadelphia where I was teaching at that time and said, "You'll never guess what's happened." She said, "I know." I said, "I've been watching it on television here. There are people on the wall, they're drinking champagne and so on." She says, "That's great, but just remember, it's okay when Germans drink champagne, but when they drink beer, look out." No offense to Germans, she was a German. These are further exercises in abstraction. This is a beautiful painting on metal plate. And this is where, in a sense, Richter enters the kind of territory that Ryman has occupied from a slightly different angle. He makes cold, sharp, acrid versions of the all-over painting with a dominant white, now increasingly recognizable as white, not a dull gray, but a dominant white that fights with garish color, that fights with itself and with its own discoloration when it mixes on the surface. And this is the first of 6 paintings, I'm only going to show you 3, that were explicitly dedicated to Cage and that were shown in the Venice Biennale. And this is him revisiting this sort of idea of what an art that is unencumbered could be. And you can see it doesn't end up unencumbered, but it does end up very much about the tactility, the immediacy, and so on. It's important to mention also that Richter has a significant innovation in all of these paintings in as much as he has eliminated the brush. These are not gestural paintings in any sense that we would normally recognize that term. He uses something that's equivalent to a squeegee for silkscreen, so that what he basically does is drag paint across the surface and allows it to mix however it will mix, and he keeps layering it and subtracting it and so on and so forth. There's a lot of decision-making about what to keep and what not to keep, just as there was in Cage's work. He rolled the dice, through the I Ching, and then he decided which results he would keep. But the point is that this is no longer gestural painting in anything like a New York school way, but it has most of the attributes that we associate with gestural painting in terms of the vividness and tactility of the surface. This is an aerial photograph taken by an American bombardier of the bombing of bridges on the Rhine, near Cologne, near where Gerhard now lives. This he took wholesale, adjusted slightly, and made into a print at just the time the retrospective was taking place here in New York. This is a remarkable image to have made, because whereas before he alluded to these bombardments, in his work he had actually never literally painted it. And so here he goes straight to the source. And of course, here's the source for the one painting I'm going to end on. This is the attack on the World Trade Center. Now, the story of this last painting is a complicated one. I can't do it all here, but suffice it to say a couple of things. One, Richter has long been interested in, more than interested in, he has long been deeply torn, fascinated, horridly fascinated by what people will do in the names of ideology. Having grown up under 2 ideological regimes, he understands intimately how seductive they are and how destructive they are. Which is one of the reasons he is so resistant to ideologies in painting, because he sees them as part and parcel of normative, coercive structures that take away from people the ability to have experiences outside of the parameters of those structures. 2, he is no stranger to political violence. In 1987, he painted a group of paintings devoted to the violence of the 1970s, of the Baader-Meinhof group, of the October group. And he did so partly because there were people in his circle who were very close in their support and affinity with the Baader-Meinhof group, and he was not. And yet he was of an age with Ulrike Meinhof, and he was fascinated how somebody of her experience, a young woman who had belonged to a pacifist anti-Nazi family during the war, could have ended up being marginally anti-Semitic and very, very violent indeed. What is the trajectory that takes people from one place to another in this particular nature? And since it was somebody of his own generation, he identified with the predicament, with the choices, the bad choices perhaps, but the choices nonetheless. And he wanted to get to the bottom, if you will, of the human drama, of the human phenomenon, if you will, of terrorism itself. On the day of the attack on the World Trade Center, Gerhard was in the air on his way to an opening here in New York at his gallery, Marion Goodman. He was detoured out of New York to Canada and went home. But thinking about all of the reporting of that event, thinking about a city that he knew very well to which it had happened, and generally trying to somehow find, if it was possible, to make visible what had happened, became an obsession for the next several years, 3 in fact. And the result of these images and many more, of drawings that prepared the subject, here's one close-up, is this painting. Now, the painting is about yay big, maybe about yay big. It's about the size of a flat screen TV. It is painted very, very thinly. And in the first iteration, and this slide again does it no justice, in the first iteration you could really see the impact of the explosion. You can see the buildings relatively clearly delineated. And then thinking that this was too much a painting version of a photographic event and too much an attempt to bring into painting something that could not be experienced in painting, he did what he often does, which is to scrape it away. And the result of it was to dissolve the buildings, which in fact what was literally happening in this process, and to create a sort of phantom or ghost image of what happened to the World Trade Center. To make, in fact, a history painting that just about categorically counters everything we have come to expect of history paintings. That is to say, it was not big. It did not celebrate a common value. It did not raise up a common hero. It did not unify the people who saw it, since probably this painting does more than anything else to disunify people. Their ambivalences, their attitudes towards it come to the fore, and those attitudes turn out not to be the same at all. And to paint, if you will, a painting where you think about the phenomenon of the destruction of the World Trade Center from all the different angles that one could. One thinks about the experience of the destruction of the World Trade Center from all the different angles that one could, which for many of us New Yorkers meant the combination not only of the media imagery, but of actually firsthand experience or eyewitness of it. And you make this kind of painting as the painting of the thing that cannot be represented, but of the non-possibility of that representation being the image. Almost as if you take Ryman's idea that it's the how of the painting that does it. But the how of the painting that does it here is to show the incapacity of the painting to do something, and in the process it partially accomplishes its task by bringing it all to bear. Now I'm going to end there since I've gone over my time a little bit, and I'd like to leave chance open for conversation and so on. But the general argument I would like to make is that it gets us nothing to make invidious comparisons between artists of this caliber. It gets us nothing to sort of set them aside because they're old. It gets us nothing to argue the crude points of politics versus non-politics. It is really about painting. And this is the image, last image. This is Ryman, one of the very first Ryman paintings. It's a small painting on paper. It's the only one that I know of which has a text other than identification text, other than his initials, the date, and sometimes comments on the medium or whether it's a trial proof. And it simply says the paradoxical absolute. In a certain way, the paradox of painting is that it is absolute and that it is also paradoxical. And what I think Ryman and Richter are engaged in, both of them, is that enterprise. So thank you.
Hi, I have a question about Richter's paintings of Madrid.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm thinking of one that's really blurred out called
Yep.
The Arena, from when Franco was in power. And it's a relatively small-scale painting.
Yep.
And I was wondering, is the painting you showed that's very structural, is that after Franco's regime ends?
No, this is during it. This was painted in the
Okay.
70s, so Franco
So
was very much in power, yeah.
So he does both. He does the blurry and the very structural during Franco's regime?
Yeah. Well, first, I'm not sure exactly what the correlation with Franco's regime is. I would.
Well, I was interested because it's under
Yeah.
a fascist leader, and you were saying before how he kind of is erasing those. So he's using both styles to represent.
Just slow down. That's what I'm trying to say. One of them was painted when Franco was very much in power. One of them was painted after Franco was in power. The latter painting is the painting of a bullfight, which is a subject treated by Picasso and many others. There are a variety of ways in which you can approach that, but I would not immediately politicize that painting, or for that matter, in the specific sense that you're talking about it, politicize it as being about fascism in Spain. I am saying you should perhaps politicize it in regard to a whole body of work which takes aerial views of cities intact and in some state of dissolution, either as images or literally falling apart before your eyes. That's the politics that I see there.
This is a bit of an aside, but one of my friends is a new student of yours up at Yale, and he said you gave a very inspirational speech last week. I was just wondering if you could touch on some of those points that he wasn't able to recall and share with me.
Another part of my multiple identities is I tend to move out of one thing into the next, and I can't remember what I said. I think I was mostly talking about how art students should use the time that they have in art school, and how it's a very good time to not lock in, and a very good time to create communities for yourself, communities that you can take, at least in part, out into the world. It's a time to make mistakes rather than prepare yourself to conquer Chelsea. It's a time to learn how to live the life of an artist day to day, what Richter calls the daily practice of painting, if you happen to be a painter, but it could be the daily practice of video or whatever you do. How to live that life in a way that actually works for you as an individual, your rhythms, your needs, so that you can continue that activity in the world without having to retool entirely, or without having to grow up under circumstances with vastly more pressure once you leave academies. So art schools are the sort of last place you can, sort of be that totally preoccupied with yourself.
I had a question about, this talk was really interesting because you're so invested in the artists, and I feel like that investment takes a lot of time. It's like getting to know someone really well takes time.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just, I feel overwhelmed by going to a group show and seeing all of the artists and not being able to invest properly in what they're going for. So I guess I was just wondering maybe your take on that, or how do you choose? Is it based on taste, or is it based on an intellectual interest?
Neither. Taste is something that I am deeply mistrustful of, although I know what Kant meant by it. I don't think taste is disinterested, and he did. I think sensibility is maybe the better word in one case. I think other than sort of thinking or reasoning or whatever it is, there's some other word we have to have for what it is that you do when you assimilate, interpret, chew over, and make sense of something for yourself, knowing that it is, of course, only a provisional sense and the first step of a larger engagement. But as to your first question, I think, you can't do right by all the things that probably do deserve your attention. You can do right by them by making sure that if you pass them by, you don't pass them by with a disparaging remark to justify your guilt over having passed them by. You just acknowledge that there's only so much you can take in, and that you will get around to them again when you can, if you can, and so on. In the late 1960s, actually, 67, 68, and all the way through the 70s, I used to come to New York from Philadelphia, mostly from Chicago sometimes, and do the galleries with somebody that I knew, who knew her way around the galleries. And the first time I did it, I was kind of shocked, because in those days there were relatively few galleries, and we tended to go to the uptown ones. So the Fuller Building and the building that Sidney Janis was in, and a variety of other buildings in sort of the 57th Street, Fifth Avenue axis. And she would get in the elevator and off the elevator terrifyingly fast. And I sort of would constantly be saying, whoa, wait a second, I haven't seen something or whatever. And I've since had this experience with my daughter. We go to the art fair together, and she lingers and I zoom ahead. But what you develop after a while is the ability to scan, basically. And if time is precious, you use that ability with some damage to work that probably deserves more of your attention, but in order that you can give more of your attention to things that you think will probably be more rewarding. The caveat to that is I tend to pay attention to things that really piss me off. So that it is not about liking things. If something gets my attention sufficiently that I have a powerful reaction against it, then I look at it longer and think about it longer. Why I don't pay attention to things very long are the ones that just sort of please me or mildly displease me.
I'm actually taking your wake up at 5 a.m. suggestion to write my dissertation. I'm exhausted, but it's working, so thank you. I have
Levi mentioned that I didn't get a PhD, and she's one of the victims. I'm totally disingenuous. I submit people to tortures I have not allowed myself to go through. Go ahead.
and I'm surviving this because I got to take courses with you. So I had sort of a twofold question, both relating to the realism and materialism that you talked about, mostly when you showed some of the Rymans with the fiberglass and the tape. And so the first part of my question really has to do with the actual materials themselves. And Ryman's primary interest seems to be in all these, the paint itself. So I'm wondering about these other materials. Did he see them as alternatives, or were they all equal in his mind?
No, they're certainly not all equal. That's the whole point. They're all different. And when Ryman talks about painting, he doesn't mean pigment. He means everything that makes the painting. And therefore, the choice of particular supports, the depth of the support, the kind of canvas, if it's canvas, if it's a metal, if it's a synthetic plastic or fiberglass or whatever it is. Lots of the most beautiful ones are made with sandwiches of multiple materials. Every detail of that, every aspect of that, including the angle from which it's seen, are important. So one of my proudest acquisitions from MOBA was a painting called Pace, which is a painting on a fiberglass laminate with cedar edges that is painted on the top with a shiny paint and on the bottom with a matte paint. And it sticks out from the wall with these sort of very simple aluminum rods, and then is supported off the floor with rods. It looks kind of like a table, actually. But the reason for this is, as in most of Ryman's work, utterly straightforward. He wanted it to be seen from all these angles, and the only way to make that happen was to, provide the support for it, if you will. But the support itself is part of the painting, as are the screws and fixtures and clamps and all the things involved. So it is precisely that each one of these are, if you will, part of the palette of the painting and part of the material presence of the painting.
Oh, great, thanks. The other question is in trying to break away from the sort of academic approach. You've chosen two words, realism and materialism, which are so loaded, and yet use them in a way that I think is sort of more understandable to everyone without that. And it just, how, I don't know how to say this, but how do you do that? Do you define realism in a new way and materialism in a new way, or how do you still use these words without necessarily bringing all that baggage with it?
Well, you actually do bring some of it there, and you also put it under a new set of stresses, because as anybody who's done language theory knows, the basis of our understanding is on the different uses of words over time, right? Things don't mean X, they mean X and Y and Z and da-da-da-da. And therefore, the minute you put a word into circulation with a different set of connotations, or maybe even a different denotation, it automatically does so in relation, this is again dialectical to use the big fat word, it's in dialectical tension with all those things we know about it. Now, sometimes the best way to deal with the revaluation of words is not to argue it, just to establish that tension and assume that an intelligent listener, reader, or whatever will engage with it as you would engage with it in order to have a greater understanding, because the purpose is not in the revaluation to create a new fixed term, but to energize a term that has gone stale in its previous usages, or that is insufficient in some aspect.
I was just curious if you could offer any further comment on the way that Richter and Ryman use language. It seems to me that Ryman kind of diffuses the titles of his paintings a lot using very general, kind of non-specific terms, whereas Richter can be far more specific, and in interviews also seems to be more direct and in kind of a lot of different directions. So if you have any insight, I would be curious to hear that.
Ryman uses language a little bit like Eva Hess uses language. The terms he uses, it seemed to me, suggest relations or possibilities or contexts or structures or whatever it is, without stating a meaning. And so you can use the word if you wish. And in a good Ryman show, if you wish means you probably won't know it until you've experienced the painting thoroughly, because the label won't be anywhere to be seen, and maybe is in a bin someplace on the side. But you can use the word to think about something in relation to the painting, or just to think about something, but it is not much more than that except the name of the painting. Because there is also a problem with endless shows of untitled number 472X. I mean, that becomes a mannerism at a certain point. And Felix Gonzalez Torres was really kind of clever. What he'd do is he'd say untitled, and then in parentheses he'd put the title, you know. But I mean, after a while it becomes monotonous to just list, you know, which untitled it is. So Ryman has chosen a kind of rich language which is associative or suggestive, but never, at least in my way of thinking about it, you could ask him, an attempt to sort of pin down a meaning. Now, what you say about Richter is actually funny, because Richter is much more evasive than Ryman is. You know, I mean, Richter's titles are often at cross purposes to what actually you're seeing. And his statements are often quite contradictory if you look at them over time. And there's a wonderful compendium of his writings that was done by Hans Ulrich Obrist called The Daily Practice of Painting, which has now been amplified into a book of Richter's writings. And over the course of his statements, you find dramatic shifts in emphasis on very important points. Now, part of this testifies to the fact that he's an artist who's grown, who's permitted himself to grow, who's indeed not only preaching against the ideology, but himself non-ideological. So he's not trying to hold a position rigidly that he took once upon a time. It's also something that one has to read historically as well as art historically. When Richter made certain statements about the lack of political thrust behind his paintings, when you look at certain phenomena like the way in which he shuffled the deck in terms of the numbering of the order of his paintings, since we know that's not the number in which the order in which they were originally made in some cases. It has to do with him developing evasive maneuvers within a highly deterministic context for German art. To be a young German artist portraying the Nazi era was a very, very difficult proposition from a number of angles. Most particularly, if you tried to do so and step out of, if you will, complicity or implication in it, and lift yourself above the whole thing and look down, it would be an act of dishonesty, quite simply. Beyond that, it would put those works in a category of rhetorical art when that is not at all the way in which they were intended. So that as you see him talking about subjects, religion, politics, hot-button subjects, he very often hedges things or says surprisingly blunt things, and then a little while later says something different. Not categorically different, but different enough to make you wonder what he meant by the first thing. But he, for example, from the very beginning made statements that said that he understood painting as connected in some ways to issues of faith and loss of faith in the terms that one would understand that if it were a religious matter. And this is stuck in the craw of many of the critics who would absolutely prefer that he not in any way invoke religious thought or metaphysical thought or mystical thought or what have you. Now, he's an agnostic of these things, but that's not to say the thing that he's a categorical disbeliever. And so it's not a flirtation, but his constantly coming back to these issues, talking about them again with new shadings, is what makes it interesting to read his writings, but you can't quote him and say, this is what Richter thinks. And interviewing him is like, you know, chasing an incredibly swift, otter through, a hedge. I mean, it's just incredible. He will turn again on any given moment and say something blunt. So, for example, in one of the interviews I did with him, I asked him about a series of works he had made, a group of paintings he had made for a Catholic church, and a couple of crosses that he had made. And I said, well, what's this all about? I thought you'd given up religion in your teens and declared yourself a Nietzschean, atheist and so on. And he knows a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Then at a certain point I said, but after all, these were things commissioned by the Catholic Church, and this particular cross is a crucifixion. He explained how it was actually made, for example. He said, you've noticed that the arms are very long on the side. And I said, yes, relative to the vertical part. He said, well, that's because I have long arms. So there's a kind of wonderful blasphemy in there. But in the end, he finally said, well, I guess I'm a sympathisant, which is the French expression adopted in German, meaning a sympathizer. Now, that is the expression that was used for people who are close to the Baader-Meinhof group. It means fellow traveler, basically. So with triple, quadruple ironies, he talks about his relation to religion as being akin to his relation to fellow travelers of Marxism, coming from a man who is anti-Marxist and nominally anti-religion. You can see how complicated these ambivalences are. When I asked him about the paintings of the Baader-Meinhof, of the World Trade Center, I talked to him a lot, or tried to talk to him a lot, about the bombing of Dresden, about how explicitly he wished to evoke it, etc. And there again, he was interestingly evasive. But interestingly evasive because he gave a little always, but never a confirmation of any particular point. So, by comparison to Jasper Johns, who's the sort of the Sybil of, hard to follow statements, these guys are remarkably straightforward. But no artist, good artist, is going to tell you exactly what he's doing, or she.
One of the images you showed of a Ryman painting has wide horizontal bands in it. You were talking about it in terms of Rothko, but I also was seeing Agnes Martin and thinking about the two of those artists as evoking luminosity through their color fields, whether those fields are pale or vivid. But it made me curious, especially after seeing her most recent show open and seeing the very dense gray paintings in the back room, thinking about how to think about her work tonight in terms of these two artists and what you might say about that connection.
Well, two things. I'd say one about facture and one about dating. Agnes's paintings were of that kind, most of them made long after Bob made these paintings. So that kind of space is something, the sort of sublime space is something that's in her work, but the ones that I was showing were antedate the things that you're talking about. The other thing is that in Ryman's case, he paints across like so, right? At least that's my impression from looking at them and so on and so forth. In her case, I know she painted them vertically. So she says it's just much easier to do it that way. But there's a kind of, if you will, an illusionism of facture, because what you think is the sweep, but in fact she's made her life easier by doing it top to bottom.
I found it very poignant when you spoke about Richter painting the Titian work 5 times, and immediately thought of Jorge Luis Borges's story, Pierre Menard, author of Don Quixote. Mm-hmm. But of course there, Borges describes Pierre Menard, his work of Don Quixote, as infinitely richer than that of Cervantes, and here it's a failure to technically repeat. And you suggested that it was a failure because he didn't have the convictions that lay behind the Titian work in some way, although he was able to technically repaint it. So I was just wondering if you could speak more to that, too, especially when there's, in Richter's case, an artist who's capable of producing such a variety of work, in the sense that Ryman, called him a clever chameleon. Where you
didn't actually use those words, but I think that's what he meant. Yeah.
Where you feel something like conviction or an experience of history is necessary for his work to succeed.
Well, I think I would doubt very much that Borges figures much in his thinking about anything. I don't know that he's read him. I don't know that he hasn't read him. But he certainly never come up in conversation. But these kinds of problems, if you want to call them, or basic things that one thinks about, come up over and over again in lots of different places. And one doesn't have to have, if you will, a source. They're embedded in the material, and they're embedded in the process. In the case of the Titian painting, it's a sort of variation on the Beckett thing, try, fail, try again, fail better. Except his progression was try, fail, try again, fail worse. But in other words, he was painting failure at a certain point, and that was the image of the painting. And it becomes more blurry. It's actually, I like those paintings a lot, but it's actually maybe not among the top paintings because it's more illustrational of something than it is the exact phenomenon that you see. But what's interesting to me is the aspiration and the level of identification and the poignancy of it. And there are, in fact, some very good quotes in the Daily Practice of Painting where he talks about just the impossibility we now have to do certain things because of the way in which we think and see those things. He loves Caspar David Friedrich. And his paintings occasionally have bordered on Friedrich-like paintings. He clearly has looked very hard at Vermeer, and sometimes his paintings almost get there. But the sense that it couldn't mean the same thing as it did then, and it may not even be possible to do it now, not because, again, of technical limitations, but because the lack of conviction or motivation that would be the extra increment of force behind doing it just isn't there. I would say, from my point of view, that is a perfectly clear-cut statement. I don't know whether he takes the next step or not and says never. I would never take the step that says never. And there's a wonderful statement of Ezra Pound's where he says something like, men of genius / women of genius are always rediscovering the laws of art that others have forgotten or mislaid. And I think one of the things that is typical, if you will, of what we call postmodernism, but was actually characteristic of modernism in its early days as well, is the rediscovery of possibilities thought to be used up.
Hi. I'm interested in, because I don't quite see how the kind of secondary narrative that you talk about in Richter's work, how that sits or sets into your argument and just the similarities you're drawing between Ryman and Richter. Like, are you just letting that drop, or are you just drawing?
Which secondary narrative are you talking about? I'm not sure.
Sorry, not the secondary, but this other narrative about his German identity. His German identity.
It's the setup for talking about the bombardment of Germany. I've written a small book about this one painting, and I was unfortunately aware of time and trying to contract things. So let me open it up just a little bit and then leave it on the written form to answer. But, you know, he is a child of the Nazi era and of the war, first and foremost. Much else afterwards, but of that first and foremost. Of somebody who experienced, on the one hand, being a part of an aggressor nation and an aggressor culture, and on the other hand, experienced the violence that came back at Germany and the utter destruction of large parts of Germany. And part of what's in the book is a kind of an arranged meeting between Richter and Kurt Vonnegut. And I try to talk about how Kurt Vonnegut's a description of the bombing of Dresden, because Vonnegut was in Dresden when it happened. He was an American POW. And how his description of it sheds light on how one might think about being bombed. And as I said, my aunt was German Jewish. She lived the entire war incognito in Germany. And she was bombed repeatedly. And she saw absolutely horrific things. And I grew up hearing stories not only of the Nazi persecutions, but also of the effects of saturation bombing of civilian populations. And I think part of what Richter is after in this painting, September, or at least in the series of meditations that lead up to it, is to make people aware of what it is like to be the target of overwhelming violence and wasting. And I think one of the things that Americans have yet to fully understand is the degree to which people in other countries, in many other countries, understand how shocking this was, understand how terrible it was, and also do not agree that it was the world historical event that many people in this country think it was, because they have seen violence far more sustained and far more pervasive. And they see America experiencing for the first time things that they have experienced over long periods of times and really in vast scale. So that the World Trade Center becomes an emblem of the dawning of an understanding, but also the end of an American kind of exceptionalist position. I'm saying that he is in dialogue with Ryman in certain areas of his work and in other areas not. That in certain areas of his work he does things with paint which takes certain aspects of abstraction as he has come to understand it and applies it to the problems of representation as he has come to mistrust it. And that to borrow a term from a critic I don't owe many debts to, but nonetheless respect, the expanded field of painting, shall we call it, in which there are a variety of possible positions and one can locate any given part of an artist's work or body of work by multiple artists or one whole body of artist's work in a variety of positions with the sort of magnetic pull of things around them. And I see these two artists as having many things that causes me to think about them in tension with each other and occasionally in harmony with each other. And partly I was responding to the invitation from Levi to talk about a variety of things. And so, since this was on my mind, I put it out there. It is not a structured argument. Again, I will retreat into my privilege of belletristic writer and not build an expanded field like Ross Krauss did. But I don't want one anyway. I think it's possible to get more by working these things around and about and using descriptive analytic language and letting it stay open.
I think we need to end there, Rob. Thank you
Okay,
very much.
thanks a lot.